Good evening. I was just contemplating the curious relationship between weather and politics. It is rather fascinating how an exceptionally cold winter in Europe can cause a fatal fever half a world away in Java. In the winter of 1794, the Dutch canals froze solid. The French Revolutionary Army simply walked across the ice. The Dutch stadtholder fled to England, and the cozy, rather comfortable world of the Dutch India Company began to melt away. Before that chilly unpleasantness, Javanese colonization was a remarkably quiet, almost domestic affair. By day, the company's representatives engaged in tedious business of making money. By night, they discarded their heavy European wools, slipped into comfortable local sarongs, and lived quite contentedly in a mestizo world of compromises and smoke. But, as is so often the case when human finds a comfortable arrangement, someone felt the urge to modernize it. Enter Marsekal Daendels, a gentleman with a fondness for large armies, centralized administration, and on occasion administering small doses of poison to those who disagreed with him. We shall observe the unfortunate young Raden Ronggo, a man of 31 who decided that dying with his boots on in battle was vastly preferable to accepting a quiet invitation to tea in Bogor. Our guide through these damp, dusty corridors of Javanese history is a gentleman who spent 18 months in Jakarta, risking chronic blisters and severe humidity to excavate 20 ring binders of secrets from the dead. I suggest you adjust your cushions, keep a close eye on your teacup, and prepare for a transition of power. The talk is about to begin.
So it was a great pleasure a couple of months back in March of 2026, late February, to make a video about really a rather crucial period in Yogyakarta history when Hamengkubuwono, the founder of the state, died on the 24th of March, 1792, and his place was taken by his eldest son, who became the second Sultan, Hamengkubuwono number 2. Yeah. And the role of the VOC, the role of the Dutch East India Company, in the person of the governor of Java's northeast coast, Pieter Gerardus van Overstraten, and his role in actually overseeing that ceremony and taking symbolic possession of the court because of the nature of the VOC's relationship, which stemmed back in 1749, December, the 12th of December, to the surrender of the state to the VOC, a formal surrender by Pakuwala II a few days before his death, and a surrender to someone who had helped him out massively during the time of the Gegerpachinan, Major van Hohendorf. Yeah. So probably no need to really recap that too much, but to reflect that in this period of Van Overstraten's report of his journey to South Central Java in March and April of 1792, the blow-by-blow account of his secretary, a Javanese-speaking and Malay-speaking secretary, very able German, Frederick Jacob Rothenbühler, and then the subsequent reports of Van Ijseldijk, who was the long-serving Javanese-speaking Dutch resident of Jogja, who was in office from the late 1780s through to 1798. 9, and then Van Overstraten's successor, Nicholas Engelhard, as governor of Java's northeast coast, and the Memory van Overgraaf, the final administrative reports of Johannes Gerardus van den Berg and Mathis Waterloo, who were the last two residents of the sort of VOC period. And I call it the VOC period because in this period, the European community was overwhelmingly mestizo, was overwhelmingly creolized. These were, obviously there were some Totok Dutch, but their status within the society in the Indies was actually determined by who they married. And they normally married Portuguese heiresses who were partly Portuguese, but also had a large admixture of Indonesian blood. So we're looking in this period, the idea that Java was in the Indies, Indonesia was ruled for 350 years by the Dutch, and this was sort of open and shut case of a colonial system is nonsense. This is a system of a commercial company, the Dutch East India Company, which is there to make money with very minimal assets, military assets and political assets and administrative and personnel assets. And those assets were enhanced by the fact that these people who they used as residents and as governors and as senior officials like Rothenbühler, the Gezaghebber, the administrative holder of authority in the Osthoek, the eastern salient of Java, were fluent in local languages. If they were not fluent in local languages, they couldn't have functioned. So that there is a sort of aspect of this culture of the VOC, which is extremely essentially absorbed into a local society. When they go home in the evenings, they're not dressing in Dutch dress, they're dressing in a sarong and kabaya if they're women, and they're in a sarong and short jacket. They are very much part of a sort of Indies world, a world which, if, for example, the French Revolution had never happened, Holland had not been conquered by French Republican armies, could have meant that the sort of modern transition to a modern state from the VOC period through to the Indonesian Republic could have taken a very different form. It could have been much more like Latin America, in which you have Creole elites essentially calling the shots until they're eventually shunted aside by a sort of indigenous elite who have tasted the fruits of Dutch education. Whereas that didn't happen. What happened after this sort of brief penumbra, for me as a historian, I'm a historian of geography from 1792 through to de Conobora's death in 1855, and I've looked at the reports right up to the First World War, is that when you come to the sort of boundary of that period, which is the time when Daendels appears on the scene, which is in January 1808, that a very different era begins to dawn. And that era dawns because of what has happened in Europe. What's happened in Europe is a political revolution of massive import. So massive that when Chou En-lai at the Bandung conference was asked about what is the impact of the French Revolution, his reply is, it's too early to say. Yeah? Terlalu dini untuk bisa jawab dengan yakin. Yeah? And the other is obviously what is happening in my own country, Britain, in the 18th century, which is an industrial revolution. Starts small in Birmingham with pin factories and textile mills, but becomes massive in the 19th century. And that changes the face of the world. Prometheus is unleashed in Europe. And that Prometheus has an impact here in the Indies. And the first avatar of that is Daendels. Daendels is a former patriot rebel, rebelling against the stadtholder, a Republican and radical, and someone who has military experience. He flees to Paris, becomes the commander of the Batavian Legion, and becomes one of the sort of running dogs of the French Revolution, a Dutch running dog, of the French Revolution. Someone who is basically there, ujung tombak, when they begin to conquer the Low Countries, from the Battle of Nervinden to the Battle of Fleurus in June of 1794, when the whole of the Austrian Netherlands is opened for the second time to French armies, through to the campaign in the winter, the very hard winter of 1794-5, when all the Dutch major rivers and canal systems and waterworks, which is the waterlinie which protects the Netherlands from foreign attack, freeze over. And a whole army, Pichegru's Army of the North, marches across the ice and conquers Amsterdam in January, and then the stadtholder flees to England, signs a Kew letters from the palace, Royal Palace in Kew in western suburbs of London, and hands over all the Dutch possessions in the east to the British, pro tem, to keep them, to protect them from falling into French hands. So you have actually a tectonic shift in the politics of Europe, in the economy of Europe, which actually produces the goods such as special Gruberval type, drilled cannon, which can drop canister shot within a few meters of each other, which completely changes the face of warfare, changes the face of governance, changes the face and the resources available to the modern states in Europe. And everybody goes through the ringer even my country, Britain, has to go through the ringer in order to survive, and creates a very clear divide between what is public and private, which was not there in the VOC time. You don't use private office for personal enrichment, and a sense of service to the state, whether that's military or civilian, most epitomized, obviously, in the state of Prussia in Germany. And this has an impact on Java. Daendels comes, he doesn't have a lot of military assets at his disposal. He boosts the army from about 8,000 to 17,000 and is able to begin to impose his will on the South Central Javanese courts. So it's no longer a sort of spoken mirrors of a fief like Van Overstraten, where he comes with the Württemberg Regiment and the Samarang Dragoons, but now you have actually more substantial military assets which can be brought to bear in order to make the states of the Vorsterland and the princely states of South Central Java bend to the will of an increasingly centralized governments in Batavia. And the first taxi off the rank in terms of a sort of rebellion, which is very important for the future, is Raden Ronggo's rebellion. Raden Ronggo, Prawira-Dojo III, is still very young. He was born in 1779. He went into rebellion in 1810. So he's a young man in his early 30s, 31, 32 years old. And he goes down to defeat because he wants to die with his boots on rather than be poisoned by Daendels in Bogor. Daendels has set himself the task of eviscerating Georgia, militarily and politically. And he eviscerates them by essentially calling out and destroying the Pentolan, the key figures within the Georgia state. One of the Pentolan is the senior administrator, the Bupati Wadono of Madiun Raya, or the area between Lau and Wilis, and someone who is a very intelligent and ambitious man like Notokusumo, who is elevated by the British as a sort of intelligence asset in Georgia with the title of Paco Alam on the 22nd of June, 1812. So what you see from January 1808, when Daendels arrives with all the trappings of the French Revolution, with the idea of a sort of service to the state, with the idea of citizenship, with the idea of honor and loyalty and national belonging, imperial belonging to essentially the Napoleonic endeavor, this changes the whole game. Yeah. So in terms of these archives which I've used, some of these archives are residency letters. I went to the archives and I looked through and made notes on a fair number of local reports, letters, and I did this from 1792 through to the First World War. This is the last folder I have, which goes from 1902 through to 1914. Yeah. And what I did was to sit myself in the archive for the best part of 18 months. And I lived in Tanah Abang Satu. I went to Harmony, took an oplet, and arrived in the Arsit at 8 o'clock in the morning. There was no mess there, so I went out on the streets in Gajah Mada in front of Suratus Sebelas, 111, which was Rainier de Klerk's great Boughton House, his country estate, and had, nasi goreng, or I had whatever it was, kacang hijau with, santan and, Javanese gula kelapa. And that's what I survived on until 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I had to go home, when the archive, which was essentially a government building, closed. And on Fridays, it closed at 11 o'clock, because of the mosque day, or 12 o'clock. So I had to be very jali. I had to actually, in order to maximize my time, I had to be there on the dot and stay, even though I was starving, right up to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then go back by oplet, and then break my fast, as it were, at home. But in that time, I was able to go from A to Z in the sense of I had almost a private archivist in Pak Sundoyo, who had worked with the last Dutch archivist, which was P.H. Koolhaas, emergency archivist in the period of the NICA, Netherlands Indies Civil Administration, between the end of the Second World War in 1949, when the Dutch had gone kaki. And he knew the archive like the back of his hand. I wasn't able to look at any finding aids, but basically, day in, day out, I ordered something or I said, this looks interesting. And he'd come to my desk and place these various archives on my desk. And I took the view, I would never in my lifetime look at these archives ever again. And I would take the most extensive notes I could in my hand. I mean, I developed verrucas on my fingers because and also on my feet because it was so damp the whole time. But basically, I was able to bring back around 20 of these ring binders, about 2,000 to 3,000 pages of notes. And this is what I intend to actually upload once they've been edited and gone through a process of AI formulation into proper English text. So the first taxi author rank is this period between 1792 and 1808, which is the sort of penumbra of the VOC. The next taxi author rank is this sort of Zaman Peralihan, the time of transition between the VOC period and the modern Netherlands Indies state, which is declared in December 1818, but de facto is already in embryo, beginning to be formed by the 19th of August 1816, when the Union flag comes down in Batavia and the Dutch tricolour is raised. And then you have the conflagration of the Java War, and then after then you have a long period in which the sort of predominant in the last year is the peace. Has the peace remained peaceful? A sort of how the Dutch East Indies state managed the former South Central Javanese monarchies, in this case, Jogja. So, in my view, there are basically 4 or 5 different periods. The first period is 1792 to 1808. The second period is January 1808 through to August of 1816, in which you have Daendels and you have Janssens, his successor, and then you have Raffles and Vendel very shortly as successor. The British interregnum and the Franco-Dutch administration after 19th of August, 1816, interestingly, really, by Dempet on the 17th of August, these important transitions seem to happen in modern history on this date, you have the Netherlands Indies state. And the Netherlands Indies state is created in order to make Holland strong again after Napoleonic Wars. Holland had been bled white by the French. They'd repudiated the national debt. They basically run a coach and horses through public finance in the Netherlands. They had sapped the Netherlands for assets to fling against Russia during the great disastrous 1812 campaign, in which Napoleon takes Moscow and then has to retreat over the Berezina, and basically the whole of the Grande Armée, which is 500,000 men strong, is cut to pieces and by Cossacks on the way back. Through to their liberation in 1813 after the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, through to the beginning of the sort of restoration of the Netherlands, which is scripted at the Vienna Conference, which ends in June of 1815. And at the Vienna Conference, Holland is made strong again by being given 2 pieces of real estate. One is in Europe, which is the former Austrian Netherlands, which becomes Belgium after 1830, and the other is their former possessions in the archipelago, Java and its Buitengebied, its outer possessions. And these are the corks which are given to the Netherlands state, now a monarchy, a united monarchy of the southern and northern Netherlands for 15 years, between 1815 and 1830, to be able to float and keep its head above water in the sort of sea of the economic slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, which followed the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And interestingly, in both cases, the Dutch made a mess of it. They made a mess in Europe because the Belgians rose in revolt in August of 1830, pouring out from the La Muette to Portugis, an opera which dealt with sort of the wrongs of the elite against the sort of hewers of wood and drawers of water in Brussels. And here in the Netherlands Indies, in what was then the archipelago, which became Indonesia, the Java War. And in both cases, they actually behaved extremely unskillfully, fiscally. They behaved extremely unskillful ethnically because they used the Chinese as the battering ram for their fiscal policies. And they created a powder keg in South Central Java. Obviously, that powder keg never entered the lists in terms of Dutch historiography, because if they'd admitted to that, they would have had to say that they had no right to be in any form of colonial authority here, because they had basically acted with extreme irresponsibility, brutality, and ruthlessness, and a very corrupt and eviscerating presence here, eviscerating culturally, eviscerating economically, eviscerating in all its forms. And that is the legacy which we live with today. So this is a sort of brief tour d'horizon. We cut here, and I'd like to basically go on towards what happens under Daendels and under the British.
Okay.